Hello, everybody. I welcome you all to this special talk within our Howard Street Robinson virtual lecture tour. My name is Stephanie Brückner. I responsible for planning those tours. Before I introduce the speaker, Dr. James Mungall, I want to give you just a quick overview about the Howard Street Robinson Medal that's awarded annually by the Geological Association of Canada. This medal recognizes a respected and well-spoken geoscientist who will further the scientific study of either Precambrian geology and or metal mining through a presentation of a distinct lecture across Canada. The medal is named in honor of Howard Street Robinson, a founding member of the GAC, whose bequest to GAC in 1977 of approximately 100,000 Canadian dollars makes this lecture tour possible. The bequest was for the furtherance of scientific study of Precambrian geology and metal mining. Thus, the GAC's Mineral Deposits Division awards the medal in odd years, and the Precambrian Division awards it in even years. And the lecturer is nominated and chosen by the Howard Street Robinson Medal Committee. So we have this year both our Precambrian 2021 medalist, which is Dr. James Mungall, as well as our 2020 medalist, Dr. Elizabeth Turner from the Harkville School of Earth Science in Sudbury. Those talks will be actually parallel to each other, and you can find information. I will put that in the chat as well. About the upcoming talks. James gives a really good talk also about mineral deposits and limited growth. And both talks of Elizabeth are very diverse. One is about the oldest fossil. She published that in Nature recently, and the other is about sedimentology controls on the Central African copper belt. But for this talk, which is a joint talk between the MDD and VIP divisions with SCAG, I welcome Dr. Jim Mungall. And Dr. James Mungall received his BSc in geology from the University of Waterloo in 1987. He did his MSc and PhD in igneous petrology at McGill, finishing in 1993. Excuse me. He did 2 years of postdoctoral research at Bayerisches Geo-Institut, followed by nearly 3 years of consulting in Quebec before joining the University of Toronto in 1999. He has worked as a consultant specializing in magmatic sulfide and chromatite deposits since 1996 and spent 1 year as chief geologist for Noront Resources during the discovery and definition of their Ring of Fire deposit group. In 2017, Jim joined Carleton University, where he now teaches mineral deposits. His research topics range from transport properties and thermodynamics of magmas to description and interpretation of mineral deposits. Thank you, Jim, for giving that exciting talk I'm looking forward to, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. And I want to thank the Howard Street Robinson Committee for nominating me or choosing me for this honor. Very grateful for it. And I also think that particularly for this talk, I must acknowledge the students who've worked on this with me. Sam Robb, Chris Jenkins, and Yao Juosen in particular have contributed much of what I'm going to show you, as well as Sandra Camo was a key contributor of some geochronological data that I'll share with you. So the point of my talk today is to give a somewhat partisan take on a very fundamental question in the study of layered intrusions and maybe igneous rocks in general, and that is, how do layers form in layered intrusions? And it's quite astonishing to me that after over a century of dedicated research, people still can't agree on the answer to the simplest question, which is, how do these layers form in layered intrusions? And then follow up a bit with why that matters to society. It's not just an esoteric question, but it actually has implications for how some extremely valuable mineral deposits are formed. Before I get started, I just want to remind people that this is under the aegis of the Geological Association of Canada, and encourage people to join if you haven't already. And the GAC does lots of worthy things, like sponsoring student activities and prizes, over $18,000 a year given out to students. It's divided into 13 disciplinary divisions and 6 regional sections. And of course, one of the main functions is organizing and helping to run the annual GACMAC meeting, which is in Halifax this spring. And if you're a member, you get some reduced registration fees for meetings and partner organizations like the Geological Society of America, the American Geophysical Union, and lower prices on some publications. And of course, the GAC is involved in recognizing people's achievements through things like the Howard Street Robinson and other medals that they give out on an annual basis. So the talk outline is here on the left. After this brief introduction, I'll talk sort of going from the general to the particular. Question how crystals form and are delivered to layers and layered intrusions. And talk a bit about just the general question about how magnets solidify. They start out as liquids, they become solids, but that's a process. Where in that process do crystals form, and do they move around after they form? And then I'll go to observations. First of all, on the very largest scale, mostly using the Bushveld complex as my example, how layers are distributed on a regional and local scale, how minerals are distributed within the layers, the mineral modes from layer to layer, some textural features that I think are particularly germane to this question, and then some chronostratigraphy that we've done on the Bushveld and actually are continuing to work on with the help of Sandra Camo at the University of Toronto. And a little bit about some forward modeling that I and my students have done to try to understand how these layer forming processes actually operate. And then I'll wrap up with a summary and try to bring it around a little bit to how this is important for mineral deposit research, just in the most general of ways. So layered intrusions are really amazing phenomena, and they're economically very important. They contain most of the world's resources of platinum, chromium, vanadium, most of the palladium, and so on, as well as being important reservoirs of titanium, niobium, phosphorus, and a few other things. And a big question in my mind for many years has been, can the mineralization types that we classically associate with layered intrusions form in other kinds of intrusions? Is it the formation of the layers that produces the deposits, or do the deposits form in a way which then could be conducive to being deposited in any old intrusion, and they just sometimes turn up in layered intrusions? And there are two big questions in igneous petrology that sort of overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing, which will play into all these things that I'm going to talk about. And the one is this distinction in people's mind between the concept of a big tank, liquid-dominated magma chamber, or the transcrustal mush system, and I'll explain those terms very soon. And the other issue, which has led to some fairly heated discussion, is whether or not crystals form within the melt and are transported before they collect where we see them, or if they nucleate and grow in situ on a solid base. And this is a fairly partisan approach to this. I'm going to show you many of the reasons that I dispute the big tank model in many cases, but not all, and the in situ model, particularly drawing on examples from the Bushveld complex. So here's the classic example of a big tank layered intrusion, the Skaregard intrusion in Greenland. This is a sort of cartoon-like cross-sectional view of it as it's inferred to be configured. And it's a box, which is a couple of kilometers deep and several kilometers wide, that formed between fault blocks during the rifting that produced the Atlantic Ocean. And the general idea, which I don't really dispute, in the broadest sense, I think almost anyone would agree that this box filled up with liquid, which was a ferrobasalt, and then that liquid gradually crystallized to form layers on the bottom and layers on the top and the sides. And there's this kind of concentric layering, which is consistent with the idea that it crystallized from the walls inward. with most of the crystals being deposited on the floor. And so this is a classic textbook example, literally, of the big tank magma chamber. And so you envision here a body of liquid, which remains completely liquid throughout its existence, and the solids are only forming on the edges. The sort of contradictory idea, which has become more and more important in many branches of igneous petrology, but is a bit of a latecomer to the layered intrusion community, is this idea of transcrustal mush systems, wherein magmas form in the mantle. This is a cross section of the crust. We have the mantle, the lower crust, and the upper crust. So magmas form in the mantle, they're injected into the crust, and some sort of very broadly acting density filter tends to make them pond at lower levels in the crust, where they evolve through assimilation and crystallization. And then the liquids that are produced from those processes can then be extracted and rise up in successive stages to higher levels in the crust. And the key feature of this hypothetical system is that at any given time, almost all of it is either solid or nearly solid, and the magmatic system is predominantly composed of mush. And by mush, people mean a lot of different things, but here I mean any mixture of solids and liquid where there's enough solid for the solids to interact with each other. So you can imagine a porphyritic lava where the crystals are so tightly packed that it's actually affecting the rheology of the whole mixture. Or you could imagine something which is effectively a brittle solid, which has pore space occupied by melt. And within these systems, we have transient magmatic events and then long periods of time when nothing is happening, and these big pockets of melt-bearing material are slowly cooling, and the melt fraction slowly diminishes. So there's a lot of time for equilibration between melt and liquid in between these sort of dramatic melt movement events. So now, again, looking in the broadest terms, this question of how crystals are delivered to layers. This cartoon is from our 2021 paper about the Bushveld in Nature Communications, and it contrasts two ways of thinking about how the crystals get to where we see them. And time or progress of the system is from left to right here. So in both cases, we start with a magma system, which is dominated by liquid. It could be a komatiitic liquid coming out of the mantle and beginning to interact with the crust. And in the classic scenario, we envision that magma evolving, which means it's moving to the right here, and it may assimilate xenoliths or wall rocks, or it may simply cool. And during that process, crystals will form. And the crystals will, as they form, they're immediately separated from the magma, and they collect somewhere to form what people might call a cumulate rock. And so as the system ages, you get more and more crystals and less melt. But at any given time, the system, the igneous system, is just liquid, and you're taking infinitesimal amounts of solids out of it as it evolves. And if there's assimilation, we call it assimilation fractional crystallization. If the wall rocks aren't involved, then we just call it fractional crystallization. In this other way of looking at things, the same magma comes into the crust. It may or may not be assimilating crustal rocks like xenoliths or wall rocks, but as crystals form, they remain in chemical communication with the liquid. Probably it's easiest to imagine that this is because they're entrained in a migrating body of magma. And so as the system ages or matures, it comes to have a higher and higher proportion of solids in it. And a magma can carry a very high proportion of solids before it's immobilized by that mushy behavior, probably on the order of about 50% solids before it gets too viscous to flow anymore. And this pair of ideas exists in the same space as this controversy between big tanks and transcrustal mushes, but they're not equivalent. You can envision either of these processes happening in a big tank or in a transcrustal mush system. Now, if we think about the process of solidification in a little bit more detail, we can see obvious textural evidence from lavas that magmas like this basalt here can entrain crystals like these olivine crystals and carry them along to some distance before they settle out. And we can also see that this is a a xenolith that was erupted from a volcano and quenched suddenly, so that the interstitial melt between these crystals was quenched to glass. So you can see this was effectively a solid on the macro scale, but it still contained a significant proportion of liquid at the time when it was suddenly quenched. So I would consider both of these to be mushy materials. And these are some of the types of things that will exist during that interval between when you start with a liquid and finish up with a completely solid rock. And I don't think I should go into this cumulus nomenclature, but just say an orthocumulate is considered to be a rock basically where these solids pile up on each other and then the melt between them solidifies. And an adcumulate rock is where there's no liquid left, either by compaction or continuous overgrowth of the crystals. All of the liquid leaves the system before it completely solidifies. So we're thinking about how crystals form, and for a crystal to form, first it has to nucleate. A liquid has to suddenly grow a tiny little seed, a nanometer scale seed, from which a crystal will grow. And this can happen in two fundamentally different ways. It can happen by homogeneous nucleation, where that little crystal nucleus suddenly appears spontaneously out of a homogeneous liquid. And there's a considerable energy barrier that tends to suppress that. And so a magma, or rather a melt, needs to be supersaturated, undercooled, or have an excess concentration of the phase before this will occur. And so that's a bit of a barrier to the homogeneous nucleation process. Heterogeneous nucleation is when the phase nucleates on an interface with another phase. So in this example, these are vapor bubbles. A vapor bubble will often have a smaller energy barrier to nucleation if it nucleates upon an existing solid melt interface. So there is a bias in igneous systems towards heterogeneous nucleation, and therefore the growth of crystals in situ on existing crystals. Now, more sort of background thinking here. I'm going to contrast equilibrium batch crystallization with fractional crystallization. And in an equilibrium process, we envision a melt solid system that's continuously re-equilibrating, as I showed in that cartoon at the beginning. So at any given time, the system as it's defined thermodynamically is partially molten, it contains solids and liquids. And the mode, that is the proportions of different minerals, can vary continuously as the temperature changes or as the bulk composition of the system, which is denoted here, X, changes. And so if you've got a continuously coexisting batch of crystals and melt, it's not, it wouldn't be at all surprising if you had some mechanical sorting of crystals from each other and from the melt. So crystal sorting is probably almost inevitable when batch crystallization is occurring. And this ternary phase diagram can be used to illustrate some of those ideas. This is anorthite diopside forsterite ternary. If you're familiar with these diagrams, then you'll understand what I'm saying. If not, you'll just have to take my word for it, because it takes me a week to explain this in an introductory course. But if you start with a melt with the composition like this, if it reaches its liquidus temperature at 1700 degrees, it'll begin to crystallize just pure forsterite crystals. And then you remove forsterite from this melt and it'll evolve down temperature until it reaches this point, which is the cotectic. And the cotectic is the locus of compositions that are co-saturated with diopside and forsterite in this case. So now any liquid along this trend here will coexist with diopside and forsterite at the same time. But the proportions of diopside and forsterite in the liquid, let's say that's sitting at this temperature at 1300 degrees, depends on the bulk composition of the system. So you can have any possible proportion of diopside and forsterite in your solid assemblage in a system that's evolving by batch or equilibrium crystallization. If we compare that with fractional crystallization, by definition, there's no re-equilibration between melt and solids. As soon as a solid phase forms, it's removed from your thermodynamically defined system. So the system itself is always liquid. And the solids that you've already formed can't have any effect on the system as it continues to evolve. In this case, we're considering it's evolving down temperature. And that may be because crystals can't interdiffuse with melt because diffusion through solids is quite slow, or we'll also commonly imagine that they're physically separated from the magma. And in a system like this, you will inevitably see a fixed proportion of solid phases in the solids that are forming. So if a melt is fractionating by fractional crystallization, the solids that form and collect at the bottom will always exist in proportions that are strictly defined by this phase diagram. And that proportion is taken on a tangent to this cotectic. So a liquid here at 1300 degrees must produce solids with the proportion of forstrate to diopside that's given by this position on this tie line. So you can't have variable modal proportions in a system evolving by fractional crystallization. And furthermore, there's a type of reaction called a peritectic. This is a temperature versus composition binary phase diagram. And again, I can't explain the whole thing, but those of you who are familiar with this will remember what I'm talking about. If you start with a liquid like liquid A here, let's say liquid, whichever, it doesn't matter. Liquid A, as you cool liquid A down, it'll reach this liquidus at this temperature and begin crystallizing forstrate, and the liquid will evolve to a more silica-rich composition until it reaches this temperature, this magical temperature, which is the temperature of this peritectic reaction, at which point the liquid and the solids will begin to react. So during fractional crystallization, what happens is the liquidus phase instantaneously changes from olivine to enstatite. And so a pile of crystals formed by fractional crystallization will be, first of all, dunite, and then instantaneously switch to being orthoperoxenite. During equilibrium crystallization, at this peritectic reaction point, then the olivine that's already formed will react with the liquid, and then you'll have a continuously varying proportion of forstrate and enstatite. So you get a rock which is actually a Harzburgite. It's a mixture of olivine and orthopyroxene. So if you find a mixture of olivine and orthopyroxene where the crystals clearly are separate grains and have accumulated as a granular texture, that rock must have formed by a process of batch crystallization where those two phases were both present simultaneously. If we consider what happens during a process of strictly heterogeneous nucleation, where crystals grow in situ, attached to pre-existing crystals, in the most commonly imagined setting, this is happening attached to a solid substrate. It could happen where one crystal grows against another suspended in the melt, but that's operationally not really much different from homogeneous nucleation. But if we consider the classic in situ crystallization model, then the crystals are growing on a solid hard ground, and they tend to then to form unidirectional growth textures like crest cumulate texture. In ultramafic rocks and when olivine is doing this, the texture is called heracite. So in the rum intrusion, we see these successive layers where olivine crystals grew with this spiky sort of texture, which is quite similar to spinifex texture in komatiites. And this is clear textural evidence for in situ nucleation and growth. And it's been suggested that chromite crystals in the Bushveld complex have grown in a somewhat similar manner, where this is a transmitted light photomicrograph, and this is just a cartoon showing chromite crystals nucleating on a hard base and then growing as chains, where each new chromite grain nucleated and grew attached to a pre-existing one to produce these sort of branching dendritic trees of chromite grains. And then the space in between is thought to have been filled in by silicate crystals that grew afterwards. So this whole scenario envisions a purely fractional crystallization process. And it tends to lead us to some fairly strict or specific predictions about the textures that should arise. On the other hand, we can see clear textural evidence in porphyritic lavas, for example, for the transport of populations of crystals of more often multiple species suspended in melt. And this is by definition not an in situ process. And the transport can be strictly local. It may only be a few centimeters out from a cooling front and then settling on the cooling base of something. Or it could be over very long distances. We see lava flows in Hawaii that travel tens of kilometers carrying olivine crystals with them. Clearly, you've had long distance transport. And so almost by definition, this process is not strictly fractional crystallization, although it might approximate it if these crystals are very slow to react with the liquid that's carrying them. But given time, you may approach equilibrium, like classically understood equilibrium crystallization during crystal transport. This will tend to promote concentric zoning of crystals because they're bathing in the same melt on all sides. And if these crystals come to rest and then get moved along by some process, either by slumping, as in this experiment, or by some kind of shear on the bottom of a flowing sheet of magma, it's almost inevitable that they will sort themselves into layers. Any kind of experiment like this inevitably produces sorted layers, depending on the hydrodynamic properties of each mineral species. Now, I'll turn my attention to the Bushveld complex, which is the sort of field example I'm using as a test case for some of these ideas. So the Bushveld is a huge layered intrusion in South Africa. This is a scale bar. So each of these sub-segments here is 40 kilometers. So the entire thing is on the order of 400 kilometers across. It's a vast body of igneous rock, which is layered on all scales from millimeters to kilometers. And it's thought that the entire thing is connected at depth. So it's basically a sill-like body which crops out around its margins. And it's broken down into zones stratigraphically, which I'll just review very quickly. The lower zone, the dark blue here, crops out around the edges. And it is a rather discontinuous series of lobes or troughs around the edge. It's composed of ultramafic rocks, pyroxenites and periddotites. Above it is the critical zone, this pale blue color here, which is subdivided into a lower critical zone, which is ultramafic. So again, periddotites and pyroxenites. And then right around where this little faint black line is, the rock types switch to be dominated by mafic rocks. In other words, rocks with feldspar in them. So some pyroxenites, but also lots of norites, gabbronorites, and anorthosites. And within the critical zone, by definition, the critical zone is that part of this layered sequence that contains discrete layers of chromatite. So rocks which are dominantly made up of the mineral chromite. And these are mined, of course, for chromium, and they're extremely valuable. Above that is the main zone here, which is a very thick sequence of mostly gabbronorites, some anorthosites. And then above that, this other blue is the upper zone, which actually cuts down through everything else all the way down to the footwall in places, and has just recently been shown to have a chilled margin against the other parts of the complex. So it really needs to be considered as probably as a separate intrusion, or if not completely separate, certainly it's younger than everything else here, and came in towards the end of the existence of the complex. The Marinsky Reef, you may have heard of, runs along very close to the top of the upper critical zone, and it's a sulfide-bearing layer of pyroxenite, which is mined for platinum. So the controversy in the Bushveld, which there are always controversies if something is big and valuable as the Bushveld, but a controversy that's become active recently is whether or not the Bushveld complex as a whole existed as a single long-lived magma chamber that was basically piled up as crystal sediments from the bottom up, whether it evolved by fractional crystallization or equilibrium batch crystallization. If the layers were delivered as batches of slushy material with a lot of solids in them, or if it was purely fractional crystallization process. And then taking this kind of thinking even farther, could it actually even be a stack of sills, which were not even necessarily all placed in stratigraphic sequence, younging upwards? So is it a transcrustal mush system or a big tank? Here's a little cross-sectional sketch of the complex, which is approximately to scale. So it's rather a lot thinner than it is wide. It dips down into the middle. And here's what the Skaregard complex looks like, or Skaregard intrusion in comparison. So just a reminder that whatever is true of the Skaregard is not necessarily true of the Bushveld. They're very, very different beasts. And just the simple scale is so different that we need to be aware that things may not have behaved in the same way. And I can't show you a whole lot of, can't give you the geo tour of the Bushveld, but here's one layer that's particularly important. It's the upper group 2 chromatite, or UG2, which runs along here in this picture. This little black line shows where it is. It's a 60 centimeter thick layer of chromatite, which is occurs along with a package of peroxenites on the order of about 20 meters thick. And in this case, it's overlain by an orthosite, underlain by norites. And this UG2 unit extends around the whole complex, more or less continuously. It's absent in a few places, but it's basically a marker horizon you can find almost anywhere. It's mined for platinum all around the complex, and it's actually the world's biggest repository of platinum. And it has an aspect ratio like a sheet of paper, a meter wide. It's very, very thin compared to its width, and it just boggles the mind that this geological feature could even exist. Whether you're a big tank proponent or a cell proponent, it still actually baffles me that this thing even exists. But there it is. This is what the UG2 chromatite looks like in a little more detail. It's 65 centimeter thick chromatite. It's actually only about 60% chromite. The rest of it is interstitial silicate minerals, but it still looks black. This is peroxenite up here and below it. So when we look at the distribution of layers like the UG2 in the Bushveld complex, one thing that you can do is to look at borehole sections taken around the complex. So this is in the far northwest, going around the western lobe, and then up along the east side of the Bushveld. And these are sort of schematic vertical sections, and these are distances there in hundreds of meters. And we're focusing on the lower zone, on the lower critical zone, the upper critical zone. And these are the different rock types. So peroxenites, Harzbergites, norites, and anorthosites. And the black lines are chromatites. And if I was running a drill program in Northern Ontario, and this was the sequence of boreholes that I had, I would say I can't correlate these layers. I would say that I can't be sure that any of these layers joins up with the ones in the adjacent holes, because I don't see any real repeatable structure to this sequence. But the people working in the Bushveld complex do make those correlations with a lot of confidence. Not everyone does. Roger Schoon and Bernd Teigler pointed out a long time ago that many of these correlations are a bit iffy, hard to support. But in respect of the people who work there, I have to admit that they use these correlations effectively in their daily operations of their mines. And so the idea is that what you call MG1 here, middle group 1 chromatite, is the same actual self-same layer here and here and here and all the way around the complex. So this is actually a discrete continuous layer of chromatite that spans the whole complex. And then I have to say that I just don't know. And I would guess that a lot of the people working there find this nomenclature useful, but they also are not actually, they can't prove these things join up. And the exposure in the Bushveld is actually lamentably quite poor. And so joining these things up does require a bit of a leap of faith. But however you view the correlation of the chromatites, it's abundantly clear that the silicate rocks around them don't correlate. You got Harzbergite just above the middle group here, and then here you've got norite above the middle group. So to argue that the same magma produced the middle group chromatites is to say that that magma was crystallizing Harzbergite simultaneously with norite, which may be true. You need to come up with some complicated explanations if that's what you think. So just pointing out that the layer correlation on the complex scale is problematic. And then looking in detail at these lower zone so-called compartments, these troughs of ultramafic rock, they're separated from each other, and then they're overlain by a continuous critical zone. So that implies that if the lower zone formed first, each of these lobes or compartments must have formed simultaneously at exactly the same level that the critical zone, which hadn't formed yet, was going to come in. And again, you can plead some special structural control that guided everything. But you could also argue that maybe they were in place under the critical zone after it had already formed, and that it formed a convenient sort of barrier, which led a lot of ultramafic rocks to be in place underneath them. So again, you can't unequivocally support either viewpoint, but I think that this regional structure allows us to consider both. Out-of-sequence layering occurs in a few places around the complex where it's exposed. Again, exposure is quite poor. Here on the eastern bushveld, you can see the lower zone ultramafic rocks forming this big ridge here. And then at the bottom of those, there's metasediments. So that's the base of the complex. But then out here in the marginal zone, we see more rocks, which are characteristic of the critical zone, upper critical zone. So these rocks, which are thought to be younger and should have been deposited on top of lower zone rocks, have somehow come to be in place underneath the lower zone. So they're either in the wrong place or they formed at the wrong time. But again, they open my mind to the possibility that the layering here didn't form in a simple layer cake deposited from the bottom up. There's even chromatites out here, rather thin ones, but chromatites nonetheless. Next, I'll look at the modes in the layers. So we have these layers. This is a norite. This is part of the norite of the upper critical zone, just below the UG1 upper group 1 chromatite on Cameron's section, if any of you have been there. And what I want to point out here is that we've got a pretty much continuously varying proportion of orthopyroxene to plagioclase in these norites. We commonly see paratectic assemblages. Now, this picture is actually from the Stillwater complex, but just because I had what I thought was a nice picture, but exactly the same rock type appears in the lower zone and in parts of the critical zone in the bushveld. So the little rusty patches are weathered olivine crystals, and the gray patches are somewhat less weathered orthopyroxene grains. And when you see this rock in thin section, it's very clear that it started out as a granular aggregate of orthopyroxene and olivine crystals with chromite grains kind of filling the spaces between those crystals. So this granular Hartsbergite is an example of that paratectic equilibrium assemblage that simply cannot form by fractional crystallization, and therefore would appear could not form by in situ crystallization. It's very common to see concentric zoning and plagioclase in the critical zone, which implies that this grain, for example, spent part of its existence suspended in a silicate melt, which is consistent with crystal transport and not with in situ growth. And these kinds of textures are also very common in and around the chromatites. You have a fairly continuous range of modal proportions of chromite, which are not consistent with a strictly cotectic assemblage. In fact, the cotectic proportion of chromite with orthopyroxene is vanishingly small. It's almost a paratectic reaction under the conditions where these rocks formed. And so you really shouldn't expect to see more than traces of chromite sitting with all of these happy granular looking orthopyroxene crystals. And in this texture, we see no evidence for in situ dendritic trees of chromite, because there are a lot of grains here that are completely free floating, and they must have co-accumulated with the orthopyroxene. Even if they did form in situ, they grew at the same time as the orthopyroxenes, because otherwise they would have just fallen until they had another chromite crystal to land on. We commonly see folded layering in the norites especially. I tend to call this wispy layering. But you can't really dispute that there's been some kind of mushy transport of this mixture of norite and plagioclase. And again here, and we often see cognate xenoliths, also called otoliths, in these rocks. So this is the basal anorthosite below the middle group 3 chromatite, again in the Cameron section, and we've got continuously varying plagioclase chromite modes here, and we have these clasts of chromatite that have been carried in. And it's hard to carry xenoliths any significant distance unless they're suspended in some kind of mush, because they'll just drop out of a purely liquid system very, very quickly. So onto the chronostratigraphy. I mean, this alone could be an entire hour-long talk, but I'll just summarize the key points here. And this work is taking samples that I had collected, and then Sandra Kama did all the work on this. This is all her dating work, very, very careful. Uranium lead geochronology using chemical abrasion, ID-TIMS, on small populations of zircon crystals. So this is a borehole called the Turfontaine 3 hole. It's near Pretoria in the southern part of the western lobe. And so these are norites, anorthosites, pyroxenites, and the little black lines here are these names, chromatites. So the UG2 is the platinum deposit. The Marinsky Reef is also a platinum deposit hosted by sulfides. And the crosses are where I took samples that Sandra dated. And she's dating some more now. We've got more work coming up. That's another time, another topic. A lot of careful petrographic and thermometric work has shown that the dates themselves, I think, we've shown they're indisputably accurate measures of the time when zircon crystallized in each rock. And the zircon grew about 100 degrees above the solidus when the rocks had reached very low melt fractions. So they grew from rhyolitic intercumulus patches within these pyroxenated rocks. And the key thing here is that the Marinsky Reef with 85% confidence, which is not overwhelming, but it's fairly compelling, is younger than the overlying main zone. That's perhaps a bit debatable, but here we've got 99.7 confidence. That's a 3 sigma confidence that the middle group 2 was emplaced, or at least, sorry, the zircon crystallized quite a bit later than the zircon in the UG1. A significant span of time, I think it's 800,000 years. And then also the middle group 2 seems to be even younger than the middle group 3 and 4, which are sitting directly above it. So that suggests, if you believe these dates, or if you accept the interpretation that they record emplacement ages, that suggests that these pyroxenites were emplaced as sills underneath pre-existing sills of different age, different composition, which means that it formed as a stack of mush instead of as a big tank. Another way of testing these ideas is if these zircons crystallized from a big tank type intrusion, where the entire complex over a thickness of 8 kilometers crystallized to being effectively solid over a few 100,000 years, and then began cooling. This is time going this way and depth here. Then the interior of the complex would remain very hot, like above 1100 degrees for a long time, while the exterior was cooling. So this hatched area shows the temperature range through time and space where zircon would crystallize. So we'd expect zircons to be a lot older on the margins and younger in the middle. But what we actually see is that zircons span a wide range of ages over a very thin stratigraphic height here in the upper critical zone, which is just completely not consistent with this model of cooling of a single thick, 8-kilometer thick slab of igneous rocks. This is a very busy diagram, but this is again time depth, and the temperatures follow the same scale here. So the hottest areas are yellow and the coolest are red. So you could do this any number of ways, but we chose to just model this using our actual zircon dates and see what we'd get. So if the upper critical zone was in place first, then it would have cooled and completely solidified and all the zircon would have grown very early. And then if the upper group was placed into that norite stack as a sill, it would have cooled and crystallized very fast, and it would retain the zircon age that we see here. And going forward, you can successfully model the emplacement and cooling of each of the layers that we dated with this idea that the complex formed as a series of discrete cooling units. Like here's the main zone and placed at this time that then cooled and solidified quickly. The upper zone came somewhat later. And then in this scenario, the lower critical zone and lower zone were in place much later than the rest of it. The takeaway point here is not that our dates are exactly right or that this is exactly the sequence of events, but it is that if you allow for the emplacement of this whole stack as a number of separate cooling units over a long period of time, then you can get stable persistence of these widely separated zircon ages through a rather thin stratigraphic column. There's plenty more work to be done here, of course. Now, a thermodynamic model, I'm getting close to the end here. For example, we've done a lot of this work. Here's an example that we published, which is illustrated on this plot of alumina versus magnesium for a bunch of different rocks around the UG2 reef. So we modeled the situation where a komatiite liquid came out of the mantle and reacted with upper crust and digested quite a lot of it, about 35% by mass, to produce a bulk composition like this. And in our thermodynamic model, which is run using alpha melts, the solid compositions are here, and the liquid compositions are here. And so a cumulate, which comprised about 25% liquid and 75% solids, would sit here at the average composition of the peroxenite in the UG2. These are the actual rock compositions in our section through the UG2. And then the liquid, well, the magma that was left over, which is 25% solids, 75% liquid, would sit here. And that's very similar to some of the marginal sills that have come through the complex and then out into the margins. So all of this just to say that you can model the emplacement of something like the UG2 chromatite and its peroxenite as a batch of a slurry of crystals produced by a batch crystallization process. And if you do that, the trace elements just follow along nicely, and the models shown here in clear symbols match the actual rock compositions quite nicely. This is the magma, this is the crust, this is the marginal zone magma, and this is the cumulate. So a model like this can be shown to work. Doesn't prove anything, but it supports the idea. And just very quickly, Yao did the same thing with basically every rock in the entire layered sequence and was able to show that you can produce all of them with similar, very simple models, including looking at radiogenic isotopes and trace elements. On the other hand, we agree that the upper zone looks as if it formed as a big tank by fractional crystallization. So I'm just showing you this to make you aware that we're not wedded to this idea of assimilation and batch crystallization. And when the evidence leads us to support fractional crystallization as a process, then we do support it. And then the last thing I want to talk about is some work that we've just published about the main magnetite layer, which is a layer of massive magnetite about 1 meter thick in the upper zone. It sits on top of a northocite. Kruger and Ladipov recently published a paper where they went in and measured the chromium concentration in magnetite very carefully over a two-dimensional surface and found that the chromium concentration is enriched in these nodes that decorate the base of the layer, and then it decreases upwards. And they modeled this as the result of a process where magnetite crystallized in situ on the bottom and grew in little mounds, kind of like stromatolites, And because chromium is highly compatible in magnetite, the concentration of chromium in the early magnetite would be high, and then it goes down as more and more magnetite is crystallized from the melt. And so this was presented as incontrovertible evidence for in situ crystallization as a process. So we went and modeled a contradictory process wherein a pile of magnetite mush forms, and then intercumulus liquid percolates up from the anorthosite underneath. And it's rich in chromium because those anorthosites hadn't yet crystallized magnetite. And so that chromium-rich intercumulus melt percolates up. And if there are local variations in porosity along that boundary, then you'll have focused flow, and you end up with these nodes with higher chromium concentration, which is just the same as what they said had to be a result of in situ crystallization. So we like our model better because it has fewer arbitrary parameter choices. But the main thing to take away from this is that these patterns don't prove that the layers form by in situ crystallization. And you can equally well use a mushy kind of model. So in summary, there's ample evidence in many igneous rocks for crystal transport and sorting, like presence of phenocrysts, these mushy kinds of co-accumulated textures I've shown you from the Bushveld, the occurrence of rock types like granular Harzburgite, and the occurrence of broad ranges of non-cotectic modal proportions in rocks. And in the case of the Bushveld, we've shown that all of these observations can be accounted for using these forward models, quite sophisticated thermodynamic models that satisfy all the observations of radiogenic isotopes, mineral compositions, mineral modes, major and trace elements. So we see, I think, fairly compelling evidence for the occurrence of mushes throughout most of the complex, and we don't see any compelling evidence for in situ growth. And so did the Bushveld, and by extension other layered intrusions like it, form in big tanks or as sills, stacks of sills, or by basal flows of mush within some sort of big tank type arrangement? Clearly, something like the Skaregard did form in a big tank. We think the upper zone of the Bushveld also did. But the main part of the Rustenberg layered suite is quite problematic. And they could have been introduced as dense crystal-laden pulses in the base of a big tank, or they could actually be all separate sills. And the geochronology is consistent with out-of-sequence sill stacking. But that idea has had a lot of pushback, and we're actually working very hard to test it further. We're not going to just rest on the data that we've already published. So in conclusion, magma chambers can form in big tanks, or the intrusions may be just stacks of mush with fairly transient melt bodies. We think the Bushveld is more like a pile of mush than a big tank. And the reason that this is important, to bring it back to practicalities, is that in our view, these assimilation batch crystallization processes take place largely in transit. And then the mineralized rocks sort themselves out into layers of different crystal contents, which of course helps if you're trying to make a chromatite. But the layering is a consequence of the local geometry of the intrusion, and the mineralized crystal mush itself can form in any context. And therefore, these magmas could be placed into intrusions that look like potatoes or any other kind of shape you want. And indeed, there are, for instance, the Lac des Îles mine is excavating palladium-rich disseminated sulfide from rocks that look very similar to the rocks in layered intrusions like the Stillwater and the Bushveld. But in that case, they're in a very different geometric form. It's a big sort of pipe-shaped body of pyroxenite and other associated rocks. So because people have assumed for decades that these big platinum and chromium-rich deposits are only going to form in layered intrusions, they've only looked in layered intrusions. So if they don't have a layered intrusion, they don't look. But I think that we need to stop looking only at layered intrusions for mineral deposits like this, and we'll probably find a lot more of them out there in places like Canada, where we don't have a Bushveld complex, but we have lots of other odd-shaped ultramafic intrusions. So that's the talk. I guess we ran almost to an hour. I can stick around as long as people want to.
Fantastic. On behalf of the GEC Mineral Deposits Division and Volcanology and Igneous Petrology Division, thank you for that awesome talk. Love learning about crystal mushes. We do have time for questions. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. Fantastic turnout. I'm going to first stop recording and then we can get into questions. So first I'll stop.